Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first keynote lecture of International Weekend of 2022. I'm Bob Summers, and I'm the Academic Director of the University of Alberta Sustainability Council. And the Sustainability Council is an academic leadership unit that works to spark learning, discovery, and citizenship for sustainability across the institution. We provide students with courses and experiential learning opportunities. We support sustainability learning through a number of our programs, including the Certificate in Sustainability, and we work to support sustainability research and teaching across the institution. And as we're doing today with our event partners and with Stephanie here, we create avenues and venues for a central conversation on sustainability related issues. But before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the University of Alberta is located on Treaty 6 territory in Métis Nation Zone 4, a traditional gathering place for diverse Indigenous peoples, including the Cree, Blackfoot, Métis, Nakota Sioux, Iroquois, Dene, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, and Anishinaabe and Inuit, and many others whose histories, languages, and cultures continue to influence our vibrant community. And I'd encourage all of you to reflect upon the territories where you are as well and the histories to them. At this time, I'd like to welcome President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Alberta, Bill Flanagan, to give a welcome to iWeek. Bill?
Hello, and thank you, Dr. Summers, and welcome everyone to the University of Alberta's International Week 2022. And I first want to wish you all a happy Lunar New Year. The year of the Tiger symbolizes courage and confidence, attributes we all need as we move the world past the pandemic and address global challenges. And thank you for joining us tonight as we kick off a week of important conversations about the urgent issues facing our world. And a special welcome to our guest speaker, economist Stephanie Kelton from Stony Brook University, who will join us in a few minutes to talk about climate change and the energy transformations we need to thrive in the future. For 37 years, the University of Alberta's International Week has created opportunities and spaces to pose challenging but necessary questions and to discuss innovative, diverse ideas. This year will be no different. The theme of this year's International Week is For a Better World, a topic that will be explored through the United Nations 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. When the Sustainable Development Goals were first proclaimed in 2015, the United Nations called them bold and transformational steps. They called upon all countries, developed and undeveloped, to work together to end poverty, improve health and education, reduce inequality, and spur economic growth, all while protecting the environment and tackling climate change. Achieving these development goals is vital to ensuring that all people are given a chance to thrive. And universities have an absolutely vital role in mobilizing the resources and expertise we need to reach these goals. By sharing knowledge and collaborating with partners around the world, we create networks with global reach. And today, the University of Alberta collaborates with post-secondary institutions in 84 countries around the world. We have 750 active learning, teaching, and research agreements with universities, representing a remarkable web of international connections. The international work by the U of A researchers, students, partners, and alumni in the areas of international development will all be highlighted this week, along with as part of International Week's Global Goals talks. And universities also work with partners at the local community level. Throughout this week, we'll be featuring how these kinds of projects play an important role in reaching the Sustainable Development Goals. International Week itself is a result of powerful local partnerships. Tonight's event is a collaboration between the City of Edmonton, the University of Alberta Sustainability Council, and the University of Alberta International. Thank you for sharing your resources, expertise, and enthusiasm to make events like this possible. And thank you also to International Week sponsors, the U of A Graduate Students Association and CJSR Campus Radio. Our world faces challenges previous generations might never have imagined. 7 years after the launch of the UN Sustainability Goals, we continue to witness devastating consequences from the rise of inequality, the ravages of climate change, and the fragility of global supply chains, not to mention the unprecedented challenges of this pandemic. These are just a few of the complex, multifaceted issues facing our planet. These issues require bold, new actions. They require diversity of thought, created through open and inclusive exchange across communities, cultures, and nations. We need this diversity of thought to help us find innovative solutions and new ways of collaborating. So once again, thank you for joining us, and please return throughout International Week to listen, to learn, to share your ideas and perspectives on the challenges we face and the solutions we need to work toward together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, President Flanagan, and welcome everyone. Welcome to our talk tonight. And on behalf of everyone involved in organizing the event, we'd really like to thank you for attending Stephanie's talk that considers the question of how can we afford the future that we must build together. So Stephanie Kelton is an economist and leading authority on modern monetary theory, a new approach to economics that's taking the world by storm. Her 2020 book, The Deficit Myth, Modern Monetary Theory and the Birth of People's Economy, shows how to break free of the myths and the misunderstandings about money and the role of taxes, debt, and deficits that have hamstrung policymakers around the world. And tonight, Stephanie is going to focus in on our challenges that we face here in Alberta. We find ourselves in a situation that the world's moving towards decarbonization, knowing that we have to do this and that we have to be a part of this. We must figure out how we do this without facing the dire economic and environmental consequences of the paths ahead. So Dr. Kelton will consider these things and offer suggestions as to how we could build our future together. So during Stephanie's talk, I'd ask you to keep your cameras and microphones off. If you have questions, just put them in the Q&A in the chat, and we will get to them as we go through after the lecture. And I'll be moderating that with Stephanie, and we will have a great discussion. So with that said, I'd like to welcome Stephanie to the stage to present.
Well, thank you very much. It's very nice to be with all of you. I can see there are a lot of people logged on for this. I imagine all over probably Canada and the US and outside the US. Some I know very early in the morning or very late at night. So thank you very much. It's nice to have an opportunity to talk with you. I know that you have an exciting week of speakers. I had an opportunity to look at some of the people who will be following this talk later in the week. And I know that you're going to have a very successful program and hear from a number of real experts on climate-related issues. And let me just start by saying that the caveat here is that I am not a climate expert. I'm not an environmental economist, and I don't have any real expertise in the science of climate change or anything else. Okay, so I want to make clear that I'm going to stay in my lane and I'm going to lean into what we understand from the scientific community and give some ideas about how we can get where it is that I think it's fairly clear that we need to be going, the path that we need to be on. And I'm going to do it from the perspective of an economist addressing, as you heard in the introduction, this nagging question about how can we afford to do what needs to be done. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and jump right in. And I am not actually going to be talking very specifically about the challenges facing Alberta, because as I said, I'm going to try to stay in my lane and I'm not an expert on the region, but I think that the kinds of things that I'm going to say will hopefully provide a framework for all of you to think through the various challenges, whether you're in a province, whether you're in an individual state in the US, whether you're somewhere in Europe, and think about what it is that governments can do, what role can they play in leading the way, right? To addressing this incredible challenge that we face globally, which is the threat of climate change. So I want to start by getting our minds in the same place. Okay, this is going to seem really strange and very simple, but I promise it's important. I want us to all channel this little beaver. Okay, I want you to put this question in your mind and keep it in your mind throughout the entire talk. And the question is this: how will I resource it? Now, if you're thinking, oh, financial resources, she's going to talk about how to pay for all of the kinds of investments we need to deal with climate change. You're wrong. That is not what I'm going to talk about. In fact, I'm specifically going to ask you to set aside for the moment questions about money and just focus on this question about how we will resource it. So this little beaver is a lucky guy, right? Because he doesn't have to deal with the nagging questions associated with financing his endeavors. He doesn't have to go off to the riverbank and sit down with the loan officer and apply for a loan and take out the financing to embark on this venture. He just
Sorry,
yes?
Stephanie,
yes,
for
yes.
the interruption. So your slide is not in the
it's not
presenter
playing.
mode.
I see.
Yeah.
It's there we go.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay,
Thank you.
sorry about that. Are we good? Did everybody get a chance to see the beaver and the question? Okay, all right. So look, the beaver gets the easy job, which is to clear away all of the nagging questions about finding the money and dealing with the permitting and all of the rest of it, right? The beaver says, I have a mission. I am out to build a safe habitat for myself and for those that I'm occupying this dwelling with. I got to find a place to do it, and I need raw materials. I need the resources. So what does the beaver do? Locates a tree, fells the tree, and begins chopping the tree up and coming up with the pieces of wood that are necessary to begin the construction process, right? So the beaver is an architect, he's an engineer, he's a worker, and the beavers set about and they build this habitat. They have a safe place, safe from predators, a place to keep them safe from the elements of the climate and the rest of it, right? This is the mission of the beaver. And I want us to think like this beaver, okay? So we've seen this done before. And I don't know how many of you have seen this video, but this was this image that I'm showing you here was taken from a video that was put out 3-4 years ago, maybe 5 years ago now. And it imagined the future that we could build together, which is the title of this talk. And it was narrated by Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And what the video did that was quite brilliant and moving and inspiring, I thought, was that it asked us to see the world as it could be, right? Imagine a world in which we made the choices to tackle climate change together on a scale, right? The scale, the ambition on the scale that the climate community, scientific community tells us we must act with boldness and with a broad scale of ambition, and to do it in a way that centers economic and social and racial justice, that leaves no one behind. So we're tackling climate change, but we're building a care economy along the way. We're ensuring that we have jobs for those who have to transition out of the fossil fuel industry and other occupations into the green economy. You ensure that there is a pathway for those folks at good wages, right? With benefits that include, in our case, we would have to say things like healthcare, education, a secure retirement, that sort of broad vision of what it would look like if we acted within 10 years' time to transform everything. And this is what they say in the video. We have to change not just the way we generate electricity and transmit power and so forth, the way we live, right? Our housing, the way we move around. Public transportation needs to become much more important. The way we eat, right? The way we grow and distribute food. The way we live, the way we work, the way we eat, the way we move around. It means touching almost every part of our economy. And that is transformative, and it's expensive. And usually it's the price tag that enters the picture first. Where will the money come from to do these things? I've asked you to set that aside and stay focused on the resources, the real resources you need to embark on this endeavor and to carry out the mission. Define the mission, figure out what you need in real terms to get there, and then resource the mission. And then we'll talk about the money piece. So it's not just a pipe dream, okay? And I know that they're in Canada and in countries around the world, Europeans have a Green New Deal idea. We've had Green New Deal proposals here. I know that you've had across Canada a range of climate-related, bold ambitious proposals to deal with the impacts of climate change. And so I'll just tell you some of the things that have been proposed here in the US. Just very recently, a senator from Massachusetts and a House member from the state of Michigan got together with other members of Congress and introduced what they called the Thrive Act, centering 4 things: climate, right? It is a climate piece of climate legislation, jobs, a care economy, and justice, and putting those 4 together and saying this is a way to address the challenge of climate change while generating 15 million good jobs along the way, centering economic, social, racial justice, and all the rest of it. How much would it cost? Now we get to the price tag. They said we ought to invest $10 trillion over the decade. So about $1 trillion a year. Senator Bernie Sanders, for whom I worked in the Senate and after as an advisor to the campaign, had his own proposal. And what he called for was $16 trillion. Again, a climate and care with jobs at the center, where you literally say the federal government will ensure a good paying job for everyone who wants to lend a hand, who wants to work and contribute. This is an all hands on deck moment. And so you want to bring everyone in who is ready, willing, and able to work and wants to contribute in some way. You want to provide a pathway in to help us. This is going to take all of us together. He said $16 trillion. Representative Ocasio-Cortez and others just last year were calling for $10 trillion for the Build Back Better agenda. The biggest piece of that would have been climate, and then money for a whole range of other initiatives that were also part of President Biden's agenda. So these are big numbers, right? But look at what you can accomplish in terms of the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, just by centering your focus on one area. If you just start with this one, right, the 8th on the list, decent work. Now I want to set aside the growth objective and say, like my former boss, Senator Sanders, the focus should not be growth for the sake of growth. Okay, we got to stay focused on, sustainable growth. And we can talk if there's time about what that looks like, but focus on the jobs, focus on the employment, and then see where you can go through that. So if you are centering your climate and care package around employment opportunities for all and making strategic investments in the economy to deal with the impacts of climate change, you're building a care economy where the jobs are oriented around caring for the climate, for the planet, for your communities, and for your people. So where does that take you? Well, you get to the climate, you can tick that box. You have centered economic, racial, and social justice. You're ensuring that jobs are available for all, that there is gender equity and pay equity. You are reducing inequality because you're creating jobs from the bottom up. You're lifting from the bottom up. You're dealing with income and wealth inequality. You're tackling the problem of clean energy because you are building out a green economy, making the investments in the energy transmission, in sustainable housing, in agriculture, clean water, all the rest of it. You're ensuring quality education. Part of the care work can be in early childhood education, right? You're providing elder care. You're lifting incomes up. These are good paying jobs. And so by definition, you're tackling the problem of poverty along the way. And you're ensuring that these are good jobs, which means they come with good benefits like healthcare and ensuring people's well-being. So what I've done is just start with one thing, the idea of ensuring employment with decent pay and good benefits, and then showed you how many of the other goals feed into that one objective. And I could have done more. Now, all right, it sounds great. Sounds wonderful. The video is inspiring. The proposed legislation is bold and on the scale that is needed. But of course, you don't just wave a magic wand and pass legislation and start embarking on these endeavors. You have to find the votes. You have to have the political will. You have to have the public on your side. There has to be buy-in, and the public has to believe that if they go along for this ride, that the government is genuine and sincere in its commitment to safeguarding people's livelihoods, so that if you have to transition out of an occupation that is no longer going to be viable, that there is a good paying job on the other side that allows you to keep your home, to keep your standard of living, to care for your family and yourself in retirement and all the rest of it. So you need buy-in from the elected officials, from the population and so forth. And there's clearly going to be a lot of opposition. Industries that perceive these things to be threats to their own profitability and economic longevity will obviously push back, as will many others. And Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez anticipates this in that narrated video. She says, we knew that we had to save the planet, and we knew that we had the technology and the capabilities and the resources to do it, but people were scared to come along for the ride. They were scared. Why were they scared? Because they were turning on the TV, turning on the radio, picking up the newspaper, listening to people who said, it's too big. It's unmanageable. It's not, it's pie in the sky, right? It's not practical. She said they will use networks of lobbying groups and think tanks to create doubt and sow the seeds of denial about what it is we can actually accomplish together. There will be a messaging, right, push against trying to get where we need to go. And so when these sort of things happen, one of the first groups that are usually trotted out to help oppose, to provide a narrative, to help oppose doing things on a bold, ambitious scale are, of course, the economists. We can be very useful in this way. And so you will see, this is, from Fox News, which is a conservative network. I know you're probably all aware. This is Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Holtz-Eakin is a conservative economist. He was the director of the Congressional Budget Office at one point, which is sort of the scorekeeper for determining, in a sense, whether proposed legislation like a Green New Deal has any chance at all of making it to the floor for a vote and becoming a bill, right, and signed into law. And so somebody like Douglas Holtz-Eakin goes on television and starts sowing the seeds of doubt and fear and says, this thing will bankrupt the nation. I looked at it. I think it would cost like $93 trillion to do what these Democrats are talking about doing. And people hear these numbers and their heads explode. They say, what in the world are they thinking? $93 trillion. They want to bankrupt the nation and all this kind of stuff. Senator Joni Ernst from Iowa hears this number and grabs onto it, and then goes out and starts repeating it and says the Green New Deal would cost more than the entire recorded spending of the United States since the Constitution went into effect. It's impossible. They are just saying it's impossible. Here are just a few more examples from conservative think tanks. So you can have people from the Heritage Institute on the one hand at the top saying this is fiscally irresponsible and all the rest. You can have sort of centrist, left, whatever bloggers out there saying these proposals would spend the nation into oblivion. Larry Summers doing what Larry Summers has been doing of late as well, which is going out and pushing back against proposed legislation and challenging the feasibility, and says, this is, I've looked at the numbers. This is not a realistic calculus. This can't be done, what these members of Congress are proposing. So you have people who are willing to think big. The Senator Sanders, the Senator Markeys, the Elizabeth Warrens, the AOCs, and the like. There are people who are prepared to move forward with a bold, ambitious package, a suite of policies to address these problems that we face. But the first question out of everyone's mouth is always, but how will you pay for it? How will you pay for it? Where will the money come from, right? And then it basically becomes not, you can't have what you can't see, what you can't imagine, but you can't have what you can't afford. So they just simply tell us that it costs too much, that it's impossible to finance, and you might as well give up. And so this is the Twitter arm of the Republican Party, the Senate Republicans, just tweeting out, Senator Sanders, Markey, AOC, these people pushing this Green New Deal, their proposals are unaffordable, right? Maybe that's why we don't have it, they say. Maybe that's why no one will vote for it. Now, we went from 16 trillion to 10 trillion, talking about doing bold things to really transform every aspect of the economy, transportation, housing, agriculture, energy, all of it, to something much more modest, which came in the form of President Biden's Build Back Better agenda. When the Democrats first started coming to some sort of agreement, coalescing around a number, the number was 3.5 trillion. 3.5 trillion spread out over 10 years. It is 350 billion a year. It's not a huge amount of money. It's certainly nowhere close to 10 or 16 trillion, but lawmakers couldn't agree on 3.5 trillion. And maybe you heard some of the names here. We had senator from Arizona, senator from West Virginia, both had different reasons for opposing what President Biden was trying to do. And the numbers started getting talked down. So we went from 3.5 trillion to something closer to 1.8 trillion. And then there were supposedly negotiations that were taking place in good faith on all sides to see if a deal could be struck to do Build Back Better at 1.8 trillion or so. Of that, 555 billion would have been climate investments, climate-related investments and research related to climate. Now, it would have been the biggest climate investment in the history of the United States of America. So it was not nothing, but it was not the trillions of dollars that experts tell us we should be investing in all of these different ways to ensure that we hit the targets and that we avoid increasing temperatures, allowing warming to increase above 1.5 degrees Celsius and so on. But it sounded like a lot, and it would have been better than nothing, to be sure. Okay, so of that 555 billion, though, more than 300 billion of that was kind of carrots, incentives to get the private sector, private consumers, private businesses to change their behaviors, to act in ways that reduced emissions, right? So you say, we want to kind of nudge them along. We'll offer rebates to get people to buy electric bikes and electric vehicles, and tax breaks for companies to invest in renewable energy capacity. They have to build out a lot of the infrastructure. We'll offer tax breaks and then sit back and hope that if we take some of the risk off the table, if we do this de-risking, that the private sector will say, yeah, it's probably a reasonable thing. I think I can be profitable. I'm getting a little incentive from the federal government. I'll go in and I'll make some of these investments. But there are no guarantees, right? With these nudges and this leaning so heavily on the private sector and hoping that the incentives are sufficiently strong that they generate the decision-making and the actions that you're after. So you sit and you wait. Okay, but this is the way that the Biden administration decided to push a climate spending package that was quote unquote fully paid for, because they decided that they didn't want to do it the way that they had just done, the way the government had just done $5 trillion of COVID spending. From March of 2020 to March of 2021, Congress passed 3 big pieces of legislation, in total kicking out $5 trillion to support the economy and deal with the effects of the pandemic and so forth. None of it was quote unquote paid for. It's just Congress sitting down and writing bills, committing to spending money in certain ways, and that money goes out the door. And yes, it increased the deficit. Yes, it increased this thing we call the national debt, but everybody was okay with that. Everybody voted for it. Then we get to Build Back Better, and the Biden administration says, no more of that, okay? This time, we're going to fully offset the spending. We don't want any of it to increase the deficit. And this is where things started to fall apart, okay? This commitment to trying to keep the spending deficit neutral by raising a bunch of new revenue, which required increasing a lot of taxes, which turns out the Democrats didn't have support for, trying to cut other types of spending, like negotiating prescription drug prices to bring that down. Turns out you don't have all the votes you need to do that. And so the deal fell apart. And we heard just earlier today from Senator Manchin, Build Back Better, his words, it's dead. So now everybody's sort of shrugging and saying, is this the last chance we have at climate? Is it slipping through our fingers? We have midterm elections this year. If legislation doesn't pass, if something doesn't pass before November, then I think the realistic calculus is that the Democrats no longer have the House. And then who knows how many years go by before you have another opportunity to do something substantial to deal with climate change. So it's dispiriting. And I think a big part of the reason that we ended up where we are, that this legislation ended up being killed, and maybe they'll break it up and pass some small things along the way, but I don't see much chance at all of a really, significant piece of climate legislation coming out before November. It just doesn't strike me as likely. Why? Because we're all hung up on all the wrong things. Where will you find the money? Whose taxes have to go up and by how much? And do you have the votes to do that? How do we stop, the spending from adding to the deficit or the debt? And what about this inflation we currently have? And we can't do anything because inflation is here. And so we are in a real trap. And I know that I'm saying all of this in the US context, but what I want to do now is to make it clear to you that I want you to draw parallels for Canada and for wherever you might be watching this from, that this is not a story that is uniquely, American. Governments around the world face these challenges. We're all in this global ship together, and the planet is warming all of us. So we've got to have global solutions. Some nations are better equipped to deliver the kind of bold spending that is going to be needed to address these problems than other countries. Currency issuing governments like the US, like Canada, like Australia, like the UK, like Japan, like China, like many other countries, currency issuing governments are in a uniquely well-positioned place to deal with these problems. Because as a currency issuer, you don't have to deal with this nagging question, where will I find the money? How will I find the money? You're the currency issuer. The US dollar comes from the US government. It can't come from anywhere else, right? You are the sole issuer of the currency that's called the United States dollar. The Canadian government is the issuer of the Canadian dollar. Japan issues the yen. Nobody else can do it, right? So you can't run out. You can spend too much, but you can't be forced into bankruptcy, and you never have to borrow your own currency from anyone. You're the issuer of the currency. If you are a province, okay, if you are an individual state, if you are California, New York, Arizona, you're in a different position. You don't issue the currency. You are financially constrained in ways that the Canadian government is not, that the United States government is not, that the Japanese government is not. So the options are more limited. If you are a Canadian province, you are revenue constrained. That doesn't mean that you don't have options to begin to do what you can do to transition away from fossil fuels and to green your economy and to try to support just transition and so forth, but you are going to be dependent on revenue in ways that the federal government, that the Canadian government would not be. So you are financially constrained in important ways, and that plays a part in terms of the policy space. What you can actually afford to do is a real question. Currency issuing governments can afford to purchase whatever is available and for sale in their own sovereign currencies. Now, the US dollar is obviously globally accepted. That gives us a very large global marketplace into which to spend, to acquire resources that we need. Other countries have more limited capacity, to be sure. Okay, but the point is you can afford to buy whatever is available and for sale in your own currency, including all available unemployed labor. So you can put every Canadian who wants to lean into the mission and lend a hand, you can employ them and put them to work doing care for planet, care for people, care for communities. All right, so what matters is you got the power of the purse, but you don't have infinite capacity to spend, in the sense that too much spending will push inflation higher. So there are limits, there are constraints. And again, think of that beaver, it's the real resources. If the real resources are lying around, available, ready to be hired, available to be employed, whether it's, you know, raw materials, labor, whatever it is, if it's available for sale and nobody else is bidding on it, then government can employ it and put it to use and direct it to public purpose aimed at dealing with climate challenges, building clean, affordable housing, and all the rest of it, okay? But inflation is the relevant constraint. As Keynes said, the famous British economist so many years ago, anything we can actually do, we can afford, okay? So if we can do it, and we know this because we've faced this challenge before. We've done this. We have literally transitioned our entire economies unexpectedly, right? And we did it during the war effort. We did it with the bombing of Pearl Harbor that drew the US into World War II. And we transitioned our economy from one that was oriented around producing largely for consumers to one that was largely oriented around producing for the war effort. We had to change everything, right? Factories that had been manufacturing automobiles were told, no more producing cars, we need you producing tanks and aircraft carriers and munitions and all the rest of it. Garment industry that was previously producing men's suits and ladies' dresses and leather shoes and high-heeled lady shoes, were told, we need you producing uniforms and boots and all of the rest of it, right? We transitioned the entire economy and we did it very quickly. How did we do it? Very successfully, because the mission was clear. You got to win the war. That was the mission. So what is it going to take to carry out the mission, to win the war? And here we go back to Keynes again. And Keynes writes this little pamphlet, this little book called How to Pay for the War. The title is misleading because you would think that Keynes is writing this down to give advice about where to find the money to carry out the war effort. Now, he's writing this for the British government. The US wasn't engaged yet in World War II, but he circulates this little guidebook. And it's basically, you know, like a blueprint for how to resource the war effort. Where are you going to get the real things that you need? How are you going to feed troops? How are you going to pull workers out of this type of employment and shift them into the military? And what are the women going to do? And how do you shift them in? And how do you manufacture the things you need, the munitions and all the rest of it? So this was a plan, and it was a plan to undertake this transition of the whole economy to a war economy, how to do it with minimal inflationary pressure. There's not going to be zero inflationary pressure. It's impossible. You're changing everything and you're doing it in a hurry. But Keynes wanted to lay out and provide a blue.
Oh, you accidentally muted yourself, Stephanie.
Is it good?
Yep. Yes.
It's good.
Okay.
We're good.
What was the last thing you heard me say? Okay, so the point is, you're not going to do it with no inflationary pressures. It would be impossible. It's too big a thing. It's too big an endeavor. But the point was to provide a blueprint for policymakers to say, hey, this is the way to go about thinking about how to carry out this transition. And my argument is that we can learn a lot from going back and looking at what Keynes had to say about transitioning the economy into a war economy as we think about how to deal with climate change, if we think of ourselves in a battle for our future lives and the lives of those who will come after us. So I'm saying we've done this before. We know what needs to be done. War planning is about ensuring you have the real resources you need and that you're managing the inflationary pressures along the way. That's the best you can do. And Keynes was mindful that it be done in a way that was as equitable as possible, that all of the hardship did not fall on those with the lowest incomes who are already, most likely to be in poverty, lowest on the income ladder, and so forth. He wanted to do it in as much as possible, a just way, so that the sacrifices that were being made during the war effort, the delayed consumption and so forth, that there would be income for those groups in particular on the other side of the war when the recovery took hold. The US paid close attention to what Keynes was saying. They circulated memos and said, we really got to pay attention because this guy's saying the whole game, if we get drawn in, is going to be about managing inflationary pressures and resourcing the war. And of course, the US did get drawn in, and you can see there from the graph on top that the government as a share of the whole economy was fairly modest. After the Great Depression, government programs ramped up under the New Deal, but it was really the war that exploded the size of government. Government took almost half of the entire GDP. And so you had a massive ramping up of the government presence and directing resource use in the economy. And you can see here what happened to inflation in the UK, where Keynes had been advising, and here in the US, where they were listening to him. Inflation got high, but we didn't have hyperinflation. It never got out of control. Governments had a suite of policies in place to manage inflationary pressures through this transition. And what I'm suggesting is, if we were to do something as ambitious as the kinds of things that were being proposed under a Senator Sanders or a Senator Markey or an AOC, if we were going that big and doing transportation, the way we live, the way we work, the way we get around, the way we grow food, then you need a suite of policies ready to put in place, and managing those inflationary pressures is really key, because that's part of how you maintain public support for what you're doing. And we can see that today. People don't like paying higher prices for things. So managing inflationary pressures is really important. So what do you do if you want to embark on something big? You start off by saying, what is it I need? Think like a beaver. What are the real resources I need to carry this out? If I want to build 10 or 11 units of affordable, sustainable housing, what do I need to build 11 units of sustainable? I need construction workers. I need lots of concrete. I need, siding. I need appliances. I need lights. I need, cable wiring. I need real resources. If I want to do broadband and EV charging stations and solar panels, those are the things I need. So you say, what is it I need? And then you look at your resource capacity. Do I have the technology to do this? I hope the answer is yes. You shouldn't plan to do things you don't have the technological know-how to do, but you can invest in R&D along the way and develop and innovate new technologies. And that's a big part of what people are proposing. So figure out what you need, figure out what your capabilities are. How many resources do you have available? Do you have the technological know-how? Do you need to seed some research in order to advance certain things technologically? And then if I don't have everything I need, where do I get the rest? How do I acquire more capacity? Where do I get it? So I'm going to speed up because we're reaching close to the end and I want the Q&A. So assess your resource needs. So here are some examples. Right? Someone writing in Forbes said we could do a sort of climate bill for something like 3% of GDP. We could retrofit buildings and have a smart power grid and get to 100% renewable energy and all this. And this is what it would cost in dollar terms. But then you look at this and you say, but what would it take in real resource terms to upgrade all buildings so that their energy, we electrify all units of housing and everything is energy efficient. What would it take resource-wise? The next one is much more ambitious, 5%, more than 5% of GDP. What would it take to resource that? So that's what you need to do. And then you look at your existing capacity. how many workers do we have? And not just these headlines. I'm just giving you a quick sample here. How many unemployed people are there that we could bring into this? But then you have to go closer, right? Because some of these you need people with particular skills. And so you can look at unemployment by occupation and say, do I have the unemployed construction workers that I would need? And if I don't, can I train them up? Can I get apprenticeships going? Can I move them away from maybe some other activity they're currently engaged in and shift them into building, resilient housing or whatever the case may be? But you have to figure out what your capacity is, use up all of the existing slack you have, and then free up capacity where you need it if you don't have enough capacity. And so I've just put down some ideas here about where you would get the extra capacity if you don't have the capacity you need. Here in the US, we don't have a single payer healthcare system. We have this patchwork, as you know, system. But if we transitioned to something that was more efficient, even slightly more efficient, that would free up a lot of resources, because we have these huge intermediaries that employ a lot of people, use a lot of resource capacity. And if we streamlined the healthcare delivery system so that those intermediaries were no longer necessary, it would free those people up to do other things. And I'm talking about unemployment, right? It would create some unemployment, but that's then how you resource other endeavors. You need other people. You can think about what you can do using credit controls. And there's a new paper coming out. I've got a copy. It's embargoed in front of me. I think it's going to be out later this month. It's coming out. Nathan Tankus is the author. It's called Reimagining Demand Management and Price Stability in the 21st Century. It's about 40 pages. Lots of ideas here on ways to use credit controls to free up resource capacity using regulatory levers. If you believe that you have parts of the budget that have more funding than is necessary to achieve certain goals, perhaps in the military budget, you say, I can free up some real resources by shifting funds into for the greening of, the economy and so forth. So the point is, there are lots of ways to think about this. We got 2 million or so people locked up in prisons and jails all over this country. We often hear discussion about prison reform that would allow nonviolent, drug offense, people who are in for substance abuse of some, marijuana or something, to come out and be freed up and available to lean in, right? Lend a hand with some of the climate challenges and so forth. So a lot of folks, including some of my colleagues, have looked at these kinds of things. Here's a paper I don't have time to talk about, but the point is, it's the real resource capacity that matters, and inflation is the relevant constraint. Can you place too much of a strain on your economy's productive capacity? Yes, you can. You can try to spend more money into the economy to accomplish all of these things on a rapid basis, and the economy just can't keep up. It doesn't have the people, it doesn't have the factories, it doesn't have the machines, it can't churn them out fast enough. And the punishment for trying to push too fast will be some inflationary pressure. So this is a political problem when inflation emerges, and you have to figure out how to manage those pressures along the way, as Keynes described, and how much of a trade-off you're willing to tolerate in terms of, another percentage or 2% inflation for the sake of the planet. So these are not answers that I can give you. These are political questions, and they're questions for a population that must ultimately bear some of the costs and ultimately support the policy. So do you have to raise taxes, and do you have to be deficit neutral to do all of this? The answer is no. You want to back into the question of the offsets. You don't start with a commitment to offset every dollar you want to spend doing climate-related investments. You want to say, how much available slack, how much policy space is there that I could carry out parts of my agenda before I need to start thinking about offsetting that spending? And taxes are one way to offset spending, but they're not the only way, and they may not even be the best way in some cases. So what do we know? This is the last slide. We know that if we have the real resources and the technological know-how, then as Kane said, anything we can actually do, we can afford. The we there being the currency issuer. For provinces, for states, local governments, and the rest, it is more challenging. And that's an important part of my message here. So the financing is the easy part. If the government is willing to commit the funding, the fiscal agent for the government is the central bank. And the central bank's job in part is to carry out payments that are authorized by the government on behalf of the Treasury or the Finance Ministry. And that's what they do. Checks don't bounce. The relevant constraint is inflation. So you want to start with the mission, figure out where you want to end up, and back your way into the legislation being drafted so that the dollars are committed to deliver on the mission itself, managing inflationary pressures along the way. So I'm going to stop and entertain some questions.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Having heard a lot about modern monetary theory, but the Twitter version as opposed to really digging in myself, this was really helpful. And so I'm going to start with a question, and then I'm going to dig into those in the chat. And there are a lot of them. So just so people know, we probably won't get to all of them. And I will look over. We've got the list and grab them as I go. So if I miss your question, I'm sorry, but we've got a lot to choose from. And so I'll start with this one. Am I correct then in understanding a little bit that this is a case of, normally when economies are a little slow, central banks will, if you will, dump a little extra money into the economy, through, buying bonds from banks and things like that. Is this a case of doing the same thing, but redirecting it to specific uses that we want to achieve, certain goals with, like climate change?
Well, okay. So I think a lot of people do what you just did, which is they look at what the central banks have done with quantitative easing. Central banks use their power to create the currency out of nothing more than their computer keyboards.
Yeah.
And they buy financial assets and they pay for them by crediting the seller's account at the central bank with reserves. We say reserves.
Yep.
Clearing settlement balances, right? And so it isn't putting money into the economy. It is trapping reserves or settlement balances in the financial system. Okay, that's where they go. So it's completely different from what the Canadian government did, say, sending out direct checks to support people in the pandemic. So you lost your job, your income is down, you've reported that you have suffered lost income, fill out this paperwork, give us the number, we replace some lost income. We did that in the US too. That's fiscal policy. That's a direct payment, goes right into the hands of the recipient. And so what you're really talking about is the use of fiscal policy, which is how I focused my remarks on using the federal government, the power of the purse, to draft legislation, define the mission, write a bill, say, this is what we want to spend on in these ways. We want dollars to go here, and we're going to pay to build EV charging stations all over the economy. We're going to provide a job at a certain wage and benefits for anybody who wants to be hired into this program doing these kinds of jobs. So it's a different policy lever.
Yep. So, I'm going to paraphrase it. There's at least 2 or 3 people, and I'm sure this is a question you've heard before, who have asked, if there's a lot of slack in the economy, this would work. It's a suggestion. But, if things are chugging along full tilt, I think, we're at 6 or 7% or 6% unemployment right now and going down here in Alberta, and in other places it's lower. What then? Do we have to pull back, or what are about those other policy tools you mentioned?
Okay. 6% unemployment is still quite high, and the official measures almost always significantly underestimate the true extent of the unemployment problem. If you want to reveal how much unemployment is actually out there, there's a really good way to do it. You announce that anybody who wants a job and doesn't have one can have a job at whatever announced wage it is, and then you see who shows up, right? And if you think there are 1.5 million unemployed people and 4 million people show up, then that's taught you something about the true extent of unemployment in the economy. But you're quite right. If you are, an economy that is approaching something that you might reasonably call full employment, you think you're getting very close on its own, right? The economy is, private sector is booming, lots of job creation, very low levels of unemployment, not a lot of slack. And you say, but I want to roll out a massive Green New Deal that transforms the whole economy. Well, you're going to have to disrupt a lot of current economic activity. And are you going to be able to do that politically? It's a political challenge, right? The government can start bidding workers away from their current jobs, but that's going to be inflationary. And the goal here is to avoid that. So this is why it was much easier to do a Green New Deal in the midst of the Great Depression, and then to have World War II come along when the economy was still significantly depressed because there was so much slack available in the economy. So the choice before us is, quite stark in the sense that if we are truly committed to acting on the time scale and with the scope of ambition that the scientific community tells us is necessary to avoid the worst effects of climate change, then we have to collectively decide that we're going to support the transformation of the agricultural and transportation and energy and everything. And we're going to understand that those dislocations are coming and that it won't be perfect and seamless and everybody won't instantaneously fall perfectly into, a new job at the same pay, but you're going to create pathways and safeguard incomes. And it isn't as easy at all in a resource constrained environment, but you have to be willing if you want to deliver on the mission, if you want to carry out the mission, you have to be willing to, deal with some of those challenges. Yeah.
That sounds, I just want to confirm, we have you till 15 after the hour, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, good. I wanted to make sure that I had my timing correct here. So here's another question. Pedro asks, countries all over the world compete for investment dollars around the globe. And is there a risk if countries begin to adopt this approach of it affecting their competitiveness on the global stage?
Well, I wish I could hear a little bit more about what Pedro is concerned about. Look, you cannot, you could, depending on how far you want to go in terms of defending the exchange rate or something like that. But this is much more challenging for countries that are vulnerable to wide swings in their exchange rate. If you are heavily dependent on the rest of the world for vital imports, if you are not food independent, if you are not energy independent, if you rely on the rest of the world for imports of medicines and technologies, you need to be able to acquire those things to feed your population, to provide energy and so forth, or you'll have, social upheaval and riots and so forth. So if your currency is vulnerable enough to a sharp depreciation means you can't get the things that you need, that's a problem. And that's where the rest of the global community, I think, comes into play. That we have to recognize that climate is a global challenge, much like the pandemic. And the response to the pandemic, frankly, doesn't give me a whole lot of optimism in a sense with respect to where we're going collectively on climate, because we have to be there for nations that can't do these things on their own. We're going to have to set up systems. We had a Marshall Plan after World War II. We're going to have to ensure that developing countries can leapfrog the transition in energy through the brown coal and fossil fuel. We don't want them to transition through that the way we did when we were industrializing and so forth. We want them to be able to leapfrog as much as possible and get to the clean energy technology sooner. And a lot of countries aren't going to be able to do that independently. And that's going to take a global coordinated effort.
Okay, great.
But wealthy industrialized countries can do this without much concern of the kind he was raising.
Okay, great. Thank you. So we had Kate Raworth on for a talk a couple of months ago, and someone asks here, and I'm wondering if they had attended that talk, because Jay asks, would you say a few words if you believe modern monetary theory and donut economics are compatible, if these things can be integrated together? So maybe that's a question you haven't heard before, but
oh, I've heard it. Not
okay.
only are they compatible, I think they're inseparable, because I don't know how you achieve the goals of the donut economy without a proper framework, an economic framework, and the design of a monetary system that allows you the capacity to achieve those objectives of pulling everyone out of the center of the donut so that there is enough for viability and life-sustaining needs and so forth, but not pushing beyond ecological, planetary boundaries and so forth. I think that the two go together. If you can see over my shoulder, there's a little owl with a little succulent little plant inside, and on that stack of horizontal books, you'll see Kate's book right behind me.
Perfect. Okay, thanks. Someone asked here, and I've kind of lost the statement, so I'll just paraphrase it. But is the idea of pushing right to the edges of growth a good idea? And I think the person asking the question is focusing on the notion of degrowth. How much do we have to focus on degrowth versus these types of investments?
Well, look, it's an important question. It's one that dogs me. I don't know that I know for sure whether degrowth is that we ought to center that as an objective. It's possible that we should. I did say that I think growth for the sake of growth is the wrong way to go. And when I say look at the resource capacity and use what you have, notice I'm not suggesting that we use up all of the fossil fuel capacity, that we extract every possible drop of oil and frack every shale. It isn't that, right? It isn't growth for the sake of growth. It isn't extraction because you can. I'm just saying, if you're trying to achieve sustainability goals and you want clean drinking water, then you got to get every lead pipe out, and you have to replace it with materials that will deliver safe, clean drinking water to every person in the country and around the world. So you got to have resources to do that. And part of what's going to happen in the process of doing that is some economic growth, right? But we have to decide how we're going to live going forward. And I don't get to play king or queen or emperor or whatever the case may be and make these decisions. These are decisions that societies have to make, and they're not easy ones. And if we're willing to say we're living too excessively, we consume too much, we need to change the way we live and work and get around and eat, and a lot of that is going to involve reducing the amount of consumption that takes place. That's going to push us in the direction of zero growth or potentially degrowth or whatever. So I think that's my answer.
Sure. Yeah, no, that sounds good. And I agree with your frustration around things like the lead pipes and so on. It seems like these are things that we should be able to achieve fairly easily, given the size of our economy. So here's another one. Oh, wait, it moved on me. Oh, I know. So Sky asks a question: how does the issuer of currency idea work when the currency is Bitcoin, like El Salvador is doing? Can it work, or does that remove the power of government to do this?
Well, look, if you have a mayor or a governor or a president who is not working with other elected officials to direct resources, and I'm talking about real resources, in ways that are oriented around delivering on a mission like climate emissions abatement or whatever, then it's not going to happen. Whether you have, a sovereign currency or whether you're embracing crypto or anything else. So I don't think the purpose and the drive of those embracing cryptocurrencies, as they're probably wrongly named or referred to, have the drive or the interest in crafting economic policy. I don't see any evidence of it, at least, oriented around dealing with climate change. Is sort of quite the opposite.
Okay, great, thanks. A few people have asked about the current state of inflation, and one individual says, do we have any idea when the current inflation will ease so that modern monetary theory can be applied? And I guess I'll add, could it be applied even in this state of inflation? And maybe your thoughts on what's causing inflation and how it plays into all of these types of things.
All right, so first thing is, we don't want to ask whether MMT can be applied. It's already here. It's a description, right? It's a framework. It's a description of the monetary system that is in place in any country. We can talk about the countries that are part of the EMU. Okay, their monetary system is very different. The Greek government, the Italian government, the German government, they don't issue the euro. So they have a monetary system that, by virtue of the fact that they voluntarily gave up their sovereign currencies, turned themselves into currency users, they're more like a province or an individual state than like a nation state, right? By virtue of what they did adopting the euro. So what was the question again?
Oh, just, the
lens and the framework. So you don't adopt MMT. It's already here. It's your framework for analysis. So you can look through the MMT lens at Italy, at Greece, at Ecuador. Ecuador is dollarized. They just adopted the US dollar. So they have a very hard constraint in terms of the financial constraint, because the Ecuadorian government can't issue the US dollar. Mm-hmm. Countries that adopted the euro have these constraints. So MMT is here and present in all places. It's a lens, it's a framework. You can apply it to identify the spending capacities of governments that operate under different monetary systems. How does government finance work with the monetary system you have in any country you want to look at? So it's here. The inflation question is different because, I think what this person is probably trying to say is, now that inflation is here, part of the question was, how long will we be dealing with this? And when will we have the space available again to embark on some of these kinds of investments? I think that might be what the question is. Yeah. So the answer to the inflation question is, I don't know, and neither does anyone else. There is a raging debate happening among economists and others, market participants and other people about, what are the drivers of the current inflation? If you ask the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Jerome Powell, he's out there giving speeches and remarks before Congress, and he's saying, look, there are a couple of things. Some of it is that people have income to spend, and to some extent, it's because of the robust fiscal support that was provided from Congress in the form of all this legislation. I told you $5 trillion. So people have had their incomes protected through the pandemic, not everybody, but a lot of folks, and they spent less and saved more along the way. And so we weren't going out and spending a bunch of money in nail salons and hotels and restaurants and bars and theaters because of the pandemic. So we shifted the way we spend money, and we had kids that were, home doing virtual learning. A lot of us were told to stay home and work from home. So we had to buy tablets and computers and furniture and turn our spare bedrooms into a home office. And so we tried to buy durable goods. And we saw what happened with supply chains. We all put a lot of pressure on supply chains, trying to order things that have to be manufactured, that are manufactured parts and pieces all over the global supply chain. And you got some inflation from that. You also have the effects of the pandemic, right? That contributed to the inflationary pressures, the supply side, the bottlenecks, the backed up ports, the trucks that can't get moving, and freight and all the rest of it. So there are a lot of things pushing on prices right now. And Powell is saying it's mostly coming from pandemic related supply chain bottleneck pressures. So when will that ease? And he basically said in his remarks a couple of weeks ago, it will really ease as the pandemic abates. You know, as long as the pandemic is raging and factories are shutting down all over the world and there are these disruptions and breaks in the supply chain, inflation will stick around and it will begin to come down. And most analysts, most economists, financial markets, the bet is that pressures ease this year and that by the end of this year, we've seen inflation fall off significantly. The Fed thinks maybe we'll be down to something like 3.5% by the end of the year. That's still elevated by historical standards and also elevated with respect to the Fed's target. But do we have to wait? Ask yourself this question. If you took seriously the threat of climate change and you believed what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and other experts are telling us, that we need to act and act fast and act boldly, and we've got 10 years to really get going on this, and you're sitting there saying, I don't know, I mean, 4 degrees warming, scientists say the carrying capacity of the Earth at 4 degrees warming is about 1 billion people. So maybe over the course of time, we lose 7 or 8 billion people. But inflation, you know, if it's 4 or 5%, we can't really do anything. I mean, the calculus to me is pretty clear. With or without inflation running at elevated levels, it's the planet. It's the planet. And we don't have a lot of time. So we've got to find ways to move forward, even if you know, we're still dealing with some inflationary pressures. We can handle those in other ways.
As a moderator, I always try and keep my opinions out of it, but I couldn't agree more. It's absolutely critical. One last question I think we have time for, and maybe it's a quick one. What about, you know, we currently subsidize a lot of oil production and fossil fuel production. We currently have a revenue neutral carbon tax in Canada. Would, you know, reducing subsidies and taxing fossil fuels give us, you know, the opportunity to have some of these funds to use in the ways that you're talking about?
Okay, who's we? Alberta or Canada?
I would say Canada and
okay.
the federal government in the US.
So I love this question because it takes us full circle, which is the little beaver. Okay, the little beaver is not worried about the money. The money is the easy part. The resources are what matters. And when you say reducing subsidies to fossil fuel or increasing taxes, what those two things can do is discourage the activity itself. And that means you free up real resources. If you pull permits and you say you're not drilling offshore, or you're not allowed to frack, we're banning fracking, or we're not going to subsidize this and that other thing, and it becomes too costly for some firms to continue to do those things, then the equipment is freed up, the workers are freed up. So what you're doing is you're helping to resource the climate agenda. It's not the money that you're after, it's the real productive capacity that you can then divert to other uses.
Excellent. Okay, well, I think we have reached the end of our time, so I'm going to say thank you very much, Stephanie. I think that everyone probably learned a lot today, and I know a number of us, I'm sure, will go off and continue to dig into this more and learn more. So I think you've started a great discussion here, and we've got quite a few people who have picked up some knowledge. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Nice to be with you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. All right, we will see you at one of our next events over the week. So please go online and take a look at the calendar and attend some of our other events. Bye, everyone.